The alien general struck a human cadet. 3 seconds later, he was begging for mercy. The formation had been standing at attention for 22 minutes when General Vreth appeared at the far end of Hangar Delta. I know it was 22 minutes because I had been counting. Every time the metal grating pressed harder into the soles of my regulation boots, I added 1 to the number. Counting was something I had always done, in waiting rooms back home in Detroit, in checkout lines, in every space that was built for someone else and tolerated me by accident. 42 cadets stood in 2 perfect rows inside the main inspection hangar of Galactic Coalition Military Academy Keth 7. The hangar was designed for species with different geometry than mine. The ceiling was 60 feet up, though only about half the cadets required that clearance. The floor grating was spaced for wider strides. The overhead lighting was calibrated for visual spectrums I had been politely advised to pretend I could not see, because acknowledging them in an official report meant a sensory accommodation form, and sensory accommodation forms took 3 weeks to process. Most of the cadets in my company were taller than me. Most had more limbs than me. 3 of them were colors I still had not found words for after 6 weeks of trying. Cadet Syrinx stood 2 spots to my left, its 6 joints folded into a posture that somehow still communicated perfect attention despite looking, from a human perspective, like someone trying to fit inside a luggage rack. I had spent 3 weeks studying what attention looked like on a Myra T, because I had made myself one promise before I left Earth: I would not be the one who missed a cue. I was the only human in Delta Company. One of 11 in the entire academy. 7 star systems. Hundreds of enrolled species. 11 humans. The number had never stopped feeling like a dare. Or an insult. Or both at once, and somewhere over the Pacific on the transport flight out I had decided the difference no longer mattered. GCMA Keth 7 orbited a dying orange star and had been the most selective military institution in the galaxy for 140 years. Humans had been granted a provisional enrollment slot 3 cycles ago, after the Accord of Merath, when the Coalition needed Earth's cooperation more than it wanted to say so in public. Nobody expected us to last past orientation week. 4 had graduated. I was going to be the 5th. I had made that promise to myself while counting soup cans in a grocery store in Detroit, which was not the most inspiring location for a life-defining resolution, but I had never been picky about where I made them. General Vreth moved into the hangar from the far end and the quality of the air in the room changed the way air changes before lightning. I had encountered that type before. Not the alien kind. But the type. The category of person who has been told, for so long and by so many, that their authority is a natural feature of the universe, that they move as though the floor is grateful for the contact. He was 7 feet tall and 4-armed, with lavender plating running from the base of his neck down his forearms and catching the overhead lights with the deep gleam of river stone worn smooth by something very old. The Kethvoran had founded the Galactic Coalition. Their military doctrine had been running the galaxy longer than my country had been a country. They had been writing the rules while humans were still arguing about which continent owned which other continent. He walked the full length of the hangar with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never, in his professional life, been asked to wait. He started his inspection at the far left of the first row. I was 3rd from the right in the 2nd row. I did the math on his pace and estimated 9 minutes. I counted bolts in the grating near my feet. 14. I counted them 3 times. With each Kethvoran cadet, Vreth performed a spoken exchange, ritual, precise, the same shape each time. A call and a response. I had studied it enough to recognize the rhythm even without knowing every word, the way you recognize a prayer you have heard 100 times without being told what it means. With the non-Voran cadets, it was inspection only. A long, assessing look. A slight nod of acknowledgement, or the deliberate absence of one. He reached me. He looked at me the way a customs officer looks at documentation that has been technically cleared but clearly should not have been. The translator piece at his collar glowed blue. The receiver fitted against my left ear processed his words in the half-second delay I had never gotten used to, the delay that always made me feel like the world's audio track was running slightly out of sync with its picture. Then the translation paused. Just under a second. Not a malfunction. Just under 1 full second, long enough to notice if you were paying attention, short enough to pretend you had not been paying attention. The translation came, biological accident. I held my face completely still. The translator hesitates when a source word has no clean equivalent. That pause means the actual word was sharper than what I received. I noted that, filed it somewhere useful, and held my face still. He raised his arm. The top right one. The dominant strike arm in Kethvoran body language. I had read about this. I had read about it in the files Lieutenant Commander Hask sent me 3 months before I shipped out, and I had read it again on the transport, and I had read the accounts left by all 4 graduates who came before me, and I had read the specific paragraph about physical protocol and what it meant and what always came after. I watched his arm raise and I understood exactly what was about to happen, and there was nothing in me fast enough to stop it. His palm connected with the side of my face. The sound it made in the enclosed space was clean. Almost precise. Like a door closing on the first attempt. My vision went white at the edges. My ear rang at a pitch with no bottom. The impact was real and specific and deliberate, and my head had snapped sideways with the full force of it. Not a warning. Not theater. Real. The entire formation went absolutely still. I knew this protocol. The Kethvoran dominant strike. It had existed at GCMA for 100 years and had been applied in the same way, responded to in the same way, resolved in the same way, across 100 different species and 100 different inspection mornings. The rules were not complicated. The commanding officer strikes. The struck cadet lowers their gaze and drops their chin. Submission signal. Hardwired into almost every coalition species through biology, through evolution, through centuries of social reinforcement building the same reflex into the same nervous systems. Drop your eyes. Look at the floor. The moment passes. The structure of the world is confirmed to everyone watching. His hand was still raised in the air above my face. Waiting. 1 second. My vision cleared. 2 seconds. I looked up. I found his eyes. I held them. In Kethvoran social biology, I had memorized this section on the transport while everyone around me slept, read it until the words stopped looking like words. Sustained eye contact from a struck subordinate sits so far outside their behavioral architecture that the nervous system does not categorize it as defiance or challenge. It categorizes it as an error. A blank space where the expected signal should have arrived. And when the nervous system registers that error, it produces an involuntary response. A pheromone release that bypasses conscious control. A chemical signal that cannot be suppressed or faked or taken back. A signal that every Kethvoran in the room could smell. There were 6 Kethvoran cadets in Delta Company. Every single one of them was smelling him right now. 3 seconds. I smiled. Not planned. Not performed. Not something I had rehearsed in the small mirror above my bunk at 0:30 before inspection day. The real one. The kind that only lives in people who have been hit before and found, to their own mild surprise, that they were still standing afterward. I said, clearly and without raising my voice, "Is that your best, sir?" The silence in the hangar was enormous. Vretha's composure, 40 years of it, built into every angle of his posture, every calibrated degree of his command presence, every way he occupied space inside a room, shifted. Not broke. Shifted. The way a structure shifts in an earthquake, still upright, still there, walls still standing, but every person inside it now knows the ground is capable of moving beneath them. He had come into this hangar with one objective. To establish, in front of 42 witnesses from 12 different species, the precise and permanent position of the human cadet at the absolute bottom of the order. Clearly. Irreversibly. With the full authority of 100 years of unbroken protocol behind the gesture. And I had looked him in the eye. And I had smiled. And 6 members of his own species had just smelled what came out of him in that 3-second window, and they would carry the chemical memory in their bodies for the rest of their lives. He said nothing. He lowered his arm. He moved to the next cadet. I faced forward and breathed through my nose and let my face ache and did what I always do when my hands want to shake and I cannot let them. I counted the bolts in the grating near my left boot. 14. I counted them again. 14. Vreth finished the inspection. His footsteps moved toward the far door and out, and the pressure seal engaged behind him with a sound like a room releasing the breath it had been holding for 22 minutes. Nobody moved. Then, from somewhere on the left side of the formation, a low sound rose from somewhere I could not place. Something beneath language, below anything my translator could process as speech. Whatever it was, Cyrix answered it from 2 spots to my left. The same sound returned. It moved through the formation like a current through still water. I could feel it without naming it. 41 beings who were not human had just witnessed something that had no precedent in any record they knew, and they were in the process of deciding what category to put it in. I kept my eyes forward. 14 bolts. Still 14. My face hurt the way a promise hurts when you have just finished keeping it. They came for me 40 minutes after the inspection ended. Not security personnel with restraints and a formal charge. 2 junior officers who knocked on the door of my bunk quarters instead of simply opening it. I noticed that. The knock was not courtesy. It was uncertainty about which protocol applied, which told me something more useful than courtesy would have. I walked with them through 3 corridors and a pressurized lift to a holding room on the station's administrative level. The room was clean and small and had 8 rectangular ceiling panels with recessed lighting overhead. A chair was bolted to the floor. A secondary chair sat along the far wall. A comm unit was built into the surface beside the door. I sat down. The 2 officers left. The door sealed. I looked at the ceiling. 8 panels. I counted twice. I had been in rooms like this before. Different ceilings. Different chairs. Same essential math, a door that only opened from one side, a piece of furniture that was not going anywhere, and the question of what you were going to do with the inside of your own head until something changed. I had learned a long time ago that you had 2 options. You could come apart, which was honest, and sometimes accurate, but almost never useful. Or you could go very still and wait, the way water goes still after something drops into it, and let the surface settle back into something you could use. I was very good at going still. My face had moved past hot and settled into a deep, flat ache along my jaw. I had a bruise forming. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming, not pain exactly, but the specific weight of tissue that has taken something and is now processing it. I did not regret what I had done. I asked myself that question directly, in the quiet of the room, and I answered it honestly. No. Not even slightly. That probably said something about the kind of person I was. I decided not to examine it too closely and counted the ceiling panels a 3rd time. 8. Still 8. Syrinx arrived 2 hours later. It should not have been there. Junior cadets did not have clearance for the administrative holding level. The fact that it was standing in my doorway meant it had located a gap in the access protocol and used it without apology, which did not surprise me. In the 6 weeks I had known Syrinx, I had understood that it treated rules the way a skilled navigator treats a map, as a useful guide to what other people expected, not as a description of what was actually possible. It folded itself into the secondary chair in the Myra T equivalent of sitting and looked at me with the compound patience of something that had decided it was going to tell me something difficult and was figuring out the order to do it in. You need to understand the full scope of what happened in the hangar, it said. I looked at him, I said. Yes, said Syrinx. That is the problem. It laid it out for me with the same care someone takes when explaining structural damage to a building. In Kethvoran social hierarchy, a dominant strike has exactly 2 valid outcomes. The subordinate submits, chin lowered, gaze dropped, and the chain of command is confirmed in front of witnesses. Or the subordinate counter-challenges, and one of 2 things is then established: either the subordinate holds a status high enough to have issued the challenge, which would mean the strike was inappropriate and a matter for review, or the superior officer was not powerful enough to achieve submission, which means the officer failed. Those were the only 2 categories. They had been the only 2 categories for 140 years. There was no third option. There was no drawer in the framework for what I had done. You neither submitted nor formally counter-challenged, Syrinx said. You held eye contact and smiled. Their entire social architecture encountered that input and produced no output. It processed as an error state in the framework itself. And when the framework produces an error state, the body responds before the mind can intervene. The pheromone release, I said. Syrinx went still in the way it went still when it was deciding how much to tell me. Then it continued. Every Kethvoran cadet in Delta Company had registered Vretha's involuntary output in real time. Not as an interpretation. Not as a rumor. As a biological fact their own nervous systems had recorded and filed permanently. And those 6 cadets had been on Keth, 7 for an average of 4 years each. They had relationships built over those years, shared meals, shared patrol rotations, shared informal hierarchies that ran quietly beneath the official one. Information in Kethvoran social networks did not travel through conversation. It traveled through presence, through proximity, through the slow accumulation of shared experience. What had happened in Hangar Delta would reach every Voran above sergeant rank on this station by nightfall. Not because anyone would report it. Because that was simply how their biology worked. He showed weakness, I said. He showed weakness in front of 42 witnesses from 12 species, Syrinx said. And then he showed a stress response that 6 of his own species recorded with their own bodies. It settled its joints. What you did was not disobedience, Mara. In their framework, disobedience is manageable. What you did was outside the framework entirely. And things that are outside the framework cannot be managed. They can only be responded to. I looked at the ceiling. 8 panels. I thought about the 4 humans who had graduated before me. I thought about what their files had looked like from the outside: clean records, quiet achievements, no incidents worth noting. I thought about what the inside of their time here had probably looked like, which was a different story altogether, and which nobody had written down. Cyrix left through whatever gap in the access system it had arrived through. 20 minutes after it was gone, the comm unit beside the door lit up with an incoming message. Sender, Earth Coalition Liaison Office, Diplomatic Division. The full text of the message was 6 words. Cadet Voss. Do not apologize. No greeting. No signature. No elaboration. 6 words from people who were several star systems away and watching closely enough to respond within hours of an inspection that had not even been publicly reported yet. I read it twice. My mother had said almost the same thing to me once. Different room. Different circumstances. The exact same tone, the tone that means, we have been waiting for this specific moment and we need you to hold it. The memory came and went in under 2 seconds. Not my mother's voice. My father's. A waiting room when I was 12 years old. A chair I had been told to sit in and wait in and not fidget in. My hands folded in my lap because I did not know what else to do with them, and the specific kind of quiet that fills a room right before something is decided about you that you have no say in. I counted the ceiling panels. 8. Lieutenant Commander Hask arrived the following morning. He came through official channels, which meant he knocked, waited for acknowledgement, and presented credentials to the door scanner before stepping inside. He was Praian, 4-armed, ancient seeming in the way of species whose baseline lifespan was 3 times a human one, with a face that had the quality of something that had witnessed many situations and decided long ago that patience was the only practical response to all of them. He had been on Keth 7 for 9 years. He had filed a formal procedural complaint against the inspection protocol 8 years ago. It had gotten nowhere. He had never publicly raised it again. He placed a data tablet face down on the table between us, sat in the secondary chair, and looked at me. You are facing a disciplinary tribunal for failure to comply with command hierarchy protocol, he said. Specifically Regulation 14, Compliance Subsection, Governing Conduct During Formal Inspection. The Keth Foreign Cadet Affairs Office filed the charge this morning. Tribunal convenes in 46 hours. They are moving quickly, I said. They are moving quickly because they want this resolved before the broader implications have time to develop and consolidate. He turned the tablet over. It displayed a page of Regulation 14. Read the compliance subsection. I read it. He waited. I read it again. It says the cadet will comply with a command hierarchy action, I said. It does, he said. It does not say how. It does not. I put the tablet down. The protocol requires compliance, Hask said. It does not specify a behavioral mechanism. It does not list the forms compliance may or may not take. It contains no physical description of what a compliant response looks like. It says, comply. That is all it says. He folded his lower 2 hands on the table. You did not strike back. You did not attempt to flee or evade. You did not speak out of turn or issue any formal verbal challenge. You held your position at attention, you remained in formation, and you maintained eye contact. I maintained eye contact, I said. The protocol has a gap, he said. The gap is named human. No one defined the form of compliance because the protocol was written for species whose stress response to a dominant strike is involuntary gaze aversion. It was never imagined that a species enrolled here might have a stress response that defaults to sustained eye contact rather than away from it. That the act of holding someone's gaze under physical pressure might be, for that species, not a challenge but simply a reflex. He held my eyes. You complied, Cadet Voss. The protocol as written was followed. The manner of your compliance was not specified because it was never anticipated, and it cannot be retroactively specified to apply to a behavior that has already occurred. I sat with that for a long moment. Why are you doing this? I asked. Not suspiciously. Genuinely. He was quiet for several seconds. The kind of quiet that means an answer is being selected carefully from several available ones. I filed a procedural complaint about this protocol 9 years ago, he said. I argued that it contained a compliance gap that would become relevant if the Academy's enrollment ever diversified sufficiently. I was told the protocol was fine. He picked up the tablet. I have been waiting 9 years for the right case to make that argument properly. The ceiling above us had 9 panels, not 8. I had already counted them. What do we need to prepare? I asked. He opened the tablet to the first of what turned out to be 47 pages of preparation materials. Everything, he said. The tribunal chamber was on the station's judicial level, 4 floors above the administrative holding block, and it had been designed for a species whose standard seating position put their eye level about 2 feet higher than mine. The chairs for the responding party were standard GCMA issue, the same chairs as the cafeteria, the same chairs as every briefing room on the station, and when I sat in mine, my feet did not quite reach the grating below. I sat at the front edge of the seat. Feet on the floor. Always feet on the floor. 3 judges occupied the raised bench at the front of the chamber. Admiral Kress, a Voran in full dress uniform, presided from the center. To his left, a Dremathi officer whose species I had encountered only twice before and whose facial expressions I could not reliably read. To his right, a Vekari judge named Aveth, who was the oldest-looking being I had seen in 6 weeks on Keth, 7, gray-scaled, 4-eyed, with the deliberate stillness of something that had been making careful observations for a very long time. Hask sat at the table beside me. On the far side of the chamber, the Keth Voran Cadet Affairs prosecuting officer stood at his own table. His name was Commander Velith. He was young for a Voran of his rank, and he wore his certainty the way some people wear a new uniform, slightly too carefully, like he was aware of how it looked. I kept my hands flat on the table in front of me and my spine straight and my face neutral. Velith presented the prosecution's case for 40 minutes. He was organized and thorough, and he spoke with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to people who should already know it. The protocol was 100 years old. It had been applied to cadets from over 60 different species in that time. The requirement was clear and the precedent was unambiguous. A command hierarchy action had been taken. The response required by regulation had not been given. The cadet in question had looked a superior officer in the eye and smiled. He said the word "smiled" the way you say the name of a thing that should not exist. He submitted the inspection report as evidence. He submitted statements from 4 other officers who had been present. He submitted a table of every previous compliance case in the tribunal's record and the outcomes of each. The data table was 32 entries long. Every single entry ended with the cadet complying. The protocol exists, he said, at the end of the presentation, because command hierarchy is the foundational structure of this institution and of the coalition military more broadly. Without it, there is no order. Without order, there is no functioning force. The protocol is not an artifact of one species' preference. It is the spine of everything built here. He sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Then Hask stood up. He did not use any visual materials. He did not submit a table of precedents. He placed both sets of his hands flat on the table, and he waited until he was certain he had the full attention of all 3 judges, and then he spoke. The prosecution's argument rests on a single assumption, he said. That Cadet Voss failed to comply with Regulation 14. I am going to demonstrate that this assumption is false. Not procedurally false. Factually false. He read the compliance subsection of Regulation 14 out loud. All of it. Slowly. Then he said, the regulation states that a cadet will comply with a command hierarchy action. It defines compliance nowhere in this document. It does not list required behaviors. It does not specify physical responses. It does not describe what compliant conduct looks like, because the authors of the regulation believe the form of compliance was self-evident. It was self-evident because every species enrolled at this academy at the time of writing shares a specific involuntary response to physical contact under a command hierarchy interaction, gaze aversion. The protocol was written for species that look away. That is what compliance looked like, because that was all compliance could look like, because no other species had ever been enrolled. He paused. Humans look toward threat, he said. Not away from it. Under physical pressure, the human stress response does not default to gaze aversion. It defaults to forward focus. Sustained eye contact in a human under stress is not a challenge. It is not defiance. It is not a counteraction of any kind. It is a reflex. A biological response as involuntary as the gaze aversion it mirrors in every other species in this chamber. He looked at Admiral Kress. Cadet Voss complied. She did not strike back. She did not flee. She did not leave formation or speak out of turn or take any action that the regulation identifies, by any definition, as non-compliant. She held her position and she looked forward. The regulation was followed as written. The manner of her compliance was not anticipated by the regulation because her species was not anticipated by the regulation. That is the regulation's gap. It is not the cadet's failure. The chamber was very quiet. The question before this tribunal, Hask said, is not whether Cadet Voss complied. She did. The question is whether a regulation written without accounting for a species can be applied to that species in the one way the regulation's authors would never have intended, to punish a biological reflex that the regulation simply failed to see. He sat down. Admiral Kress called a recess. The corridor outside the tribunal chamber was wide and long and lined with the kind of neutral, functional surfaces that all corridors on military installations look like when nobody has had time or reason to make them look like anything else. I walked to the far end with Hask and stood near a viewport that looked out at the orange star, which was doing its slow, patient work of dying. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Vreth stood 10 feet away. He was not in his full inspection dress. A different uniform, less formal, which I had never seen him in. He looked, in an unsettling way, more like a person in it. He was not flanked by aides. He had walked down this corridor alone. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything. Hask had gone still beside me with the quality of stillness that means paying very close attention to everything at once. Vretha's translator piece glowed. He said, "You are not afraid of me." It was not a question. It was also not an accusation. It had the shape of an observation that had been sitting somewhere in him for 2 days and had finally been said out loud. I thought about the most honest answer. "No," I said. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he walked past us and down the corridor and around the corner and was gone. His footsteps did not change pace. Neither did mine. Hask looked at me. I looked at the orange star. What did his pheromone output say? I asked. Hask was quiet for a moment. "I am not Kethvorin," he said. "I cannot smell it." "But you know someone who can," I said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. We went back inside. Judge Yvette was the one who caught me in the corridor just outside the chamber entrance, 2 minutes before the recess ended. She did not approach me the way officers approach cadets. She approached me the way a researcher approaches a subject they have been watching long enough to have formed a genuine question. She said, "We have been observing human cadets at this academy for 3 enrollment cycles. 11 cadets across 3 years. We have collected data. And there is one question none of that data has answered." She waited. I said, "What is the question?" "Why do you not break?" she said. Her 4 eyes held mine steadily. "Every species we have ever enrolled here breaks under sufficient pressure. Not as a failure. It is simply the mechanism. The system breaks, and from the breaking it learns, and from the learning it rebuilds stronger. That is how hierarchy training functions. But humans, in 3 years and 11 cadets, have not broken in the way the system predicts. You bend. You sustain damage. But the breaking point does not come." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" I thought about it. I thought about holding rooms with 8 ceiling panels and fathers' voices and doors closing and waiting rooms where decisions were made about you that you had no part in. I thought about the specific education that comes from growing up in spaces that were built for someone else. "We do break," I said. "We just do it somewhere nobody can see." She considered that. Then she nodded once and walked inside. The tribunal reconvened. The 3 judges returned to the bench. Admiral Kress read from the official ruling document in the formal Vorin cadence that every ruling at GCMA had been delivered in for 140 years. Cadet Mara Voss. Charge: failure to comply with Command Hierarchy Protocol, Regulation 14, Compliance Subsection. Finding: not guilty. Basis: the regulation does not specify a behavioral mechanism of compliance, and no evidence has been presented that the cadet's conduct violated any defined element of the regulation as written. And then the addendum. Kress kept reading. Pending immediate review, all enforcement of Regulation 14 compliance standards would be evaluated against documented species-specific psychological and physiological baselines. No compliance action could be taken against any cadet for a behavioral response consistent with their species' documented stress architecture. He set the document down. I sat very still and listened to the silence in the chamber after the last word and looked at a point on the back wall of the room and breathed. They had written the way humans respond to being hit into coalition military law. The ruling spread through Keth 7 faster than I had expected, which was faster than anything I had thought possible on a military station that prided itself on the slow and formal movement of official information. By the time Hask and I stepped out of the tribunal corridor, 3 Dremathi cadets from the station's upper residential block were already speaking in low, rapid tones about something and stopped when they saw me. Not in an unfriendly way. In the way people stop a conversation when the subject of it has just appeared. Syrinx was waiting outside the administrative level entrance. It fell into step beside me without saying anything for almost a full minute, which for Syrinx was the equivalent of a very long speech. The addendum, it said finally. Yes, I said. They codified it, it said. Yes. They wrote it into the standing regulations of the oldest military institution in the galaxy, it said, that humans do not look away. I did not answer that. It did not need one. I ate dinner in the Delta Company mess that evening at my usual spot at the end of the third table. Owen Cole, who was from South London and had been at the academy for 4 months longer than me and who had, in 6 weeks, said fewer words to me than I had said to the ceiling of my holding room, walked in from the far entrance, got his tray, crossed the full length of the mess, and sat down next to me. He did not say anything. He slid his tray sideways until the edge of it touched the edge of mine. That was all. I looked at my food and I did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say that the tray had not already said. And then Nora, who was from Dublin and had the kind of angular stubbornness in her face that I had recognized on first sight as the same stubbornness I carried in mine, came in and sat on my other side. And then Pete, who was from somewhere in Montana and barely talked to anyone, came in and sat across from Owen without being invited, without being asked, and without making any ceremony of it whatsoever. 4 humans at the same table. No speech. No celebration. No formal acknowledgement of anything. Just trays touching. That was the whole thing, with humans. We did not need a ceremony. We could build something that mattered out of absolutely nothing, in the middle of a mess hall, over food that tasted like it had been designed by a committee that had never eaten anything. 2 days after the ruling, General Vreth submitted a formal request for a private meeting with me. Through official channels. I was sitting with Syrinx in the corridor study alcove on the 6th residential level when it came through on my comm. I read it twice. Syrinx read it over my shoulder, which I had long since accepted as one of the things that happened when you were friends with a Myra T. Then Syrinx made a sound I had never heard from it before. I looked at it. What was that? It took a moment. That was laughter, it said. You were laughing. In Kethvoran social hierarchy, it said, a superior requesting a meeting with a subordinate is standard procedure. But a superior requesting, through official channels, a private meeting with a specific subordinate who just survived a tribunal that challenged that superior's conduct, that is a submission signal. Not an informal one. A formal one. He submitted his request through the same administrative system used for official apologies. It made the sound again, shorter. He has never in his career done that. I checked. I sat with that for a long moment. How did you check? I asked. I have access to systems you are better off not knowing about, it said. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon in one of the station's neutral conference rooms, the kind used for interdepartmental briefings and treaty discussions, with round tables that had no head position built into them. I arrived 2 minutes early and sat with my back to the wall. Vreth arrived alone. He was in the less formal uniform again. I was beginning to understand that the formal one was the performance and this was what was under it, which was both more and less comforting than I had expected. He sat across from me. Not at an angle. Directly across. He did not speak immediately. He looked at the surface of the table, which was the first time I had seen his eyes not fixed on something specific, and I understood that he was organizing something internally that he had not had to organize in this way before. Then he asked me to keep what he said next between us. I told him I would. He said, before this inspection cycle began, I was briefed by the Joint Human Integration Review Committee on expected behavioral performance from human cadets in Delta Company. He was looking at the table. I was told that under command hierarchy pressure, the human stress response defaults to compliance through submission. I was told that sustained authority application would produce gaze aversion and physical deferral within 4 seconds. He paused. I was told you would fold. The room was very quiet. Who told you that? I asked. He was silent for a long moment. His translator piece did not glow. He was not speaking aloud. The pheromone output, which I obviously could not smell, but which I had begun to understand as a language running underneath all the spoken ones, Syrinx had told me what it sounded like when Vreth released it in the tribunal corridor. One word, in the chemical vocabulary of his species, that translated approximately as shame. I understood, sitting in that room, that he was not going to give me a name. Not because he was protecting someone, but because giving me the name would require him to acknowledge that he had used a briefing from a committee, rather than direct observation, to make a decision about a person standing 2 feet in front of him. And that was a different kind of shame from anything the tribunal had touched. It doesn't matter who told you, I said. He finally looked up. You acted on what you were given, I said. That is not a small thing. But it is also not the only thing you did. He was quiet for a long time. Then, the review committee will be restructured. The briefing protocol for human cadets will be rewritten. He said it flatly, without the cadence of an offer. As a statement of what had already been decided. The regulation gap that was exploited in your tribunal will be addressed properly, not patched. And the 4 compliance cases in this Academy's record that involved cadets from species whose stress responses were not accounted for in the original protocol will be reviewed retroactively. He paused. I cannot undo the inspection. I can change what it produced. I looked at him. He was a general who had spent 40 years in a system that told him the hierarchy was the entire point. That the order was the thing being protected. And I had demonstrated, in 3 seconds, in front of 42 witnesses, that a hierarchy is only as real as the people inside it believe it to be. That authority is not a feature of the universe. It is an agreement. And agreements can be renegotiated. He had not understood that before the hangar. He understood it now. I thought about whether I had anything to say to that. I thought about the 12-year-old with her hands folded in her lap. I thought about the 4 humans who had graduated before me and what they had carried quietly without anyone changing a single regulation on their behalf. Thank you, I said. For coming. He stood. He straightened his uniform in the way that had always looked like the management of command presence, but now looked, very slightly, like a man getting his footing back. He left. I sat in the empty conference room for a long time. At some point, I noticed my hands were shaking. I looked at them the way you look at something that belongs to someone else. They were mine. I knew they were mine. But the shaking felt like information that had been waiting politely for me to have a quiet room to deliver itself in. I pressed them flat on the table. I did not count anything. I just let them shake. After a while, they stopped. 6 months is a strange unit of time on a station that orbits a dying star. The star did not mark seasons. It did not change color in the way that autumn changes the color of a Michigan sky. It simply sat there, enormous and slow and committed to its own gradual ending, and the station circled it on a schedule that had nothing to do with the rhythms my body had been built for. But 6 months was enough for things to change, and things had changed. Delta Company's ranking cadet board listed my name at the top. Not because anyone had arranged it that way. Because I had done the work, and the work had been done well, and at GCMA, when those 2 things were both true at the same time, the board reflected them. Syrinx was ranked 2nd, which it found amusing and which I found entirely correct. Owen Cole was 5th, which he would have found amusing if he expressed amusement in any way other than the occasional micro-lift of one corner of his mouth. The review committee had been restructured. The compliance regulation had been formally amended. 3 retrospective case reviews had been filed. None of this happened in any public way. It happened in documents and records and administrative updates that most cadets on the station would never read. But Hask had sent me a notification when each one was finalized, and each time he had sent it with no accompanying message, which was his way of saying, we did what we said we would do. Vreth had taken early retirement. Officially voluntary. No citation of specific cause. The station had a new general, a Dremathai named Vorak, who moved through inspection formations with the brisk efficiency of someone who had better things to do than establish dominance over anyone. She had looked at my ranking placement on her first day and said simply, good, and moved on. The Integration Review Committee briefing protocol for human cadets had been rewritten. I had not been consulted in the process. I did not need to be. The people who had been consulted were the 4 graduates who had come before me, whose accounts had been pulled from the quiet places they had been filed and placed in front of the committee members like a stack of evidence that had been waiting for someone to finally look at it. Owen still slid his tray over in the mess. Nora still sat on my left. Pete had started talking more, which turned out to mean he had a very dry sense of humor and opinions about agricultural policy that were extremely specific and surprisingly entertaining. The 4 of us had not had a single formal conversation about any of it. We did not need one. On the morning of new intake day, I was assigned as a company guide. Guide was not a formal rank. It was a role given to senior cadets whose records and standing made them a useful reference point for incoming classes. You walked the line during intake formation. You answered questions. You were, in some abstract sense, the first face of the institution that a new cadet saw and registered. I was the only human assigned to guide duty in Delta's intake cycle. There were 4 human cadets in the new class. The highest single-cycle human intake in the Academy's 3-year provisional enrollment history. I stood at the edge of the hangar, different hangar from Delta's, Hangar 7, which was used for first-day intake formations because it had better lighting and did not carry the specific atmospheric weight of certain recent events, and watched the new class file in. They were all sizes. All shapes. All colors, including 3 that I still had no names for, though I had gotten better at not trying to name them and simply seeing them. They moved with the careful, studied attention of cadets who had been told exactly what to do and were doing it with great precision because they did not yet know which rules mattered and which ones were simply the furniture. The 4 human cadets stood in the formation like they had been distributed by someone who understood the mathematics of isolation. Not clustered together. Spread across the 2 rows with the same spacing as everyone else, because they had been instructed to stand with the same spacing as everyone else, and they were following instructions with the thoroughness of people who had arrived determined to get every detail right. I walked the line. I stopped at the first one and checked her posture and gave her one adjustment and moved on. The second, a tall cadet from somewhere in Scandinavia based on the specific way his jaw was set, had perfect form and needed nothing. The third was a young woman who could not have been more than 17 and who was doing an impressive job of hiding the fact that she was running on 3 hours of sleep and the specific terror of having just arrived on a military space station for the first time. I stopped at the fourth. He was the youngest-looking human in the intake. 17, maybe just barely 18. From his bearing I placed him somewhere in the American Midwest, that specific combination of practicality and a deep, structural refusal to admit that anything was wrong until it was extremely wrong. His posture was good. His uniform was correct. His eyes were fixed at the middle distance with the focus of someone who was thinking about 37 things at once and had decided that the best strategy was to look like they were thinking about none of them. His name tag said Cal Harper. His hands, at his sides, were pressing slightly too flat against his thighs. The kind of flat that means, if I relax them even slightly they will shake. I had been those hands. I stopped in front of him. He tracked me without moving his head, eyes cutting sideways and then back, and I saw the calculation happen in the half-second before he reset his face to neutral. I was a senior cadet, ranking cadet, and I was not supposed to be stopping here specifically. His chin came up a fraction. His hands pressed flatter. I said, quietly enough that only he would hear it, when something comes at you and you do not know what it is yet, you have 3 seconds before your body decides for you. Use them. That is all. Just use them. His eyes came to mine. He held them, which I noted. He said, "Yes, Cadet Voss." I moved on down the line. I did not look back. I finished the line and took my position at the edge of the formation and watched the intake briefing proceed with the formal cadence that every intake briefing at GCMA had proceeded with for 140 years, which now had 3 amended subparagraphs in it that had not been there 7 months ago. I looked at the overhead lights. Fluorescent, faintly orange from the star's spectrum outside. Very standard. Very ordinary. 42 ceiling panel bolts worth of ordinary. That evening, after the intake day processing was complete and the new class had been assigned to their quarters and Delta Company had been released from guide rotation, I went to the observation deck on the station's outer ring. I went there sometimes when the corridors of the station had been full of people for too long and I needed the specific silence of a view with nothing moving in it. The observation deck was a half-circle of reinforced transparent paneling that jutted from the station's outer shell like a pocket of air. The dying orange star sat in the center of the view, doing what it always did, burning on the long downward slope of its own existence with an enormous, uncomplaining patience that I had begun to find something close to comforting. I sat on the low bench along the inside wall of the deck and I looked at the star and I did not count anything. I thought about the 3 seconds. I had never told anyone the truth about them. Not Cyrix, who had been 2 spots over in the formation and had felt the current move through the room. Not Hask, who had built a legal defense around the biology of the moment. Not Owen, whose tray touched mine at dinner. Not the 4 graduates whose files had been pulled from storage. Not the committee that had restructured its protocol. Not Vreth, in the quiet conference room with the round table. Not even myself, exactly. Not out loud. Not in a way I had put into direct words. The truth was not complicated. It was just small, and small truths have a way of being harder to say than large ones, because large ones have speeches built for them and small ones have to be said in their own plain words with nothing underneath them. The truth was this. I was not brave in those 3 seconds. I was not performing defiance or engineering a moment or making a calculated decision about the social architecture of the Kethvoran hierarchy. I was not thinking about the 6 cadets who would smell his output or the 42 witnesses from 12 species or the 100-year-old protocol or the 4 graduates who had come before me. In those 3 seconds, I was not thinking about any of that. His palm had connected with my face and my vision had gone white and my ear had rung and my head had snapped sideways, and then the white cleared, and my nervous system, which had been through variations of this before and knew exactly what came next, did the only thing it knew how to do. It asked, what comes next? Not, is this survivable? Not, am I safe? Not, what does the hierarchy require of me right now? Just, what comes next? The simple forward question. The question that had been asked and answered in every hard room and every difficult chair and every waiting room where someone else was deciding something about me, asked and answered so many times that it had become the only question I knew how to ask. What comes next? What do I do now? What is the next thing? The next thing was to clear my vision. The next thing was to look for the source. The next thing was to find his eyes, because my body already knew what it was looking for before my mind caught up with it. The next thing was to still be there. To still be upright and present and in the room and accounted for. That was all it was. I was not made of courage. I was made of something older and simpler and considerably less dramatic than courage. I was made of the specific inability to stop asking what comes next. To be so thoroughly habituated to continuing forward that stopping had simply never become an option the nervous system offered. That was the human thing. Not fearlessness. Humans were afraid of extraordinary numbers of things, including but not limited to the dark, failure, rejection, deep water, small enclosed spaces, large open ones, things with too many legs, things with too few, and the specific silence of a phone that is not ringing when it should be ringing. Not strength. Humans broke constantly. Alone. In the places where the ceiling panels were familiar and no one was watching and the hands were allowed to shake. Just, what comes next? What comes next? What comes next? An answer so ingrained it had become a reflex. A reflex so practiced it looked like courage to everyone watching from the outside. I sat on the observation deck bench with my hands resting on my knees, not flat, not shaking, just resting, and I looked at the dying orange star and I thought about Cal Harper in the intake formation. The hands pressed too flat. The jaw set in the Midwestern way. The eyes cutting sideways to track me before resetting to the middle distance. I thought about what he would face in the next week. The month after that. The year after that. I thought about the specific education of being the thing in the room that was not anticipated by the room's original design. I thought about what it cost, and what it built, and what the difference was between those two things. He had held my eyes when I spoke to him. I had noticed that. 3 seconds. Just use them. He had not understood yet what that meant. He would. Not from being told. You could not be told what it meant. You could only be handed the question and carry it until your body learned to answer it faster than your mind could second-guess the answer. I looked at the star. Somewhere in 7-star systems, there were 17 cadets now enrolled at GCMA. Not 11. 17. The number had grown because the number was allowed to grow now, because the thing that had always turned it back had been named and amended and filed into the official record of the institution that had once called the first of us a biological accident. I had not done that alone. I had done it in a moment that lasted 3 seconds and in the work of 6 months before it, and in the study and the counting and the holding rooms and the files read on transport ships, and in everything that 42 witnesses had seen and carried forward in their own ways. I had done it with Sirix's precision and Hask's 9-year-old complaint and Owen's tray and Nora's jaw and the 4 names in the graduation records that no one had thought to look at properly until they had no choice. And I had done it with the 12-year-old who had sat in a chair that was not built for her and held her hands flat in her lap and looked at a door and asked, "What comes next?" She had no idea. She had started the answer anyway. I stood up from the bench and stretched my back and looked at the orange star one more time. It burned the way it always burned. Patient. Enormous. Committed to continuing for as long as it could continue. Not fearless. Just really, really bad at stopping. I had a morning formation at 0600. I went back inside. The corridor was quiet and long and completely ordinary, and I walked down it and counted the overhead lights without meaning to. 31. I smiled. Old habit.